why do you think that some of these characters get almost like treated as if they're cartoon characters instead of historical figures?
I think part of it might just be that you like to tell the good story. The good story as in we're the good guys, and also the good story as in that's a very exciting story and one that a kid is going to latch onto and easily remember. And listening to your episode on The Martian, it rung straight in my brain. Yeah, when something's planted there, it's a colonized area. This is a safe place we can settle.
Hello and welcome to Talk Ag to Me, the podcast dedicated to improving ag literacy around the globe. I'm your host, Brendan Black, and today's episode is a little bit different. Instead of having your average consumer on for an episode, I actually have somebody who has experience in a part of agriculture that's not often talked about, more of the research and historical side of things. I think it's going to be kind of an interesting one. So before we get started, I'm going to let my guest, Matt Hellier, the host of his own podcast, kind of plug his own information, kind of give a little bit of background about who he is and where he comes from. Matt, take it away.
Alrighty. Hey, everybody. I'm Matt, as Brendan said, and I'm the co-host of ReviewParty.com, the only podcast that looks at internet reviews and then reviews them. I'm not really going to be talking about that at all today. What I am going to be talking about is my senior thesis that I had to do back in college a few years past now, which was all about Johnny Appleseed and his orchards, his trees, and travels across the early American frontier. By day, I am a GIS analyst. For those who don't know the term, GIS is Geographic Information Systems. Fancy word for computer map making. And yeah, my thesis, I didn't go the direction that everyone else did in terms of what to analyze, but I think it was a richer project for that.
Yeah, no, it definitely sounded interesting. You know, when you were describing it to me, that was something that I had heard very little about, and so I was very, very interested in hearing, you know, what you found and kind of, you know, what led you to that decision to write on that topic in the first place. Before we get started, kind of the essential question I ask all of my guests is, what, if any, experience do you have in the agriculture industry? I mean, obviously with your thesis, you've studied apples quite a bit, but what other experience or knowledge did you have going into it before you started that paper?
Well, in my studies in geography, becoming a geo major, which not a whole lot of people do. No one really sets out to be a geo major. You only take a class and then decide, I actually like this stuff. I'm going to keep doing it. In some of those classes, I mean, location is everything. We hear that whether it's a business or whether it's a field or a city, a civilization, location determines so much. And particularly in agriculture, you know, what kind of crops are you going to grow? How well are they going to do? Some of the most fascinating things I remember learning were in my remote sensing classes, where whether it's satellites or planes, the sensors that you can load on these things are scanning infrared or imagery, LiDAR, all these different bits of data that you can collect to determine what's going to grow best where based on the topology, based on the drainage that you can analyze from above, and how LiDAR can be so accurate as to pick up what kind of vegetation is actually there based on the color that's being reflected, based on the shape of the leaf pattern, or you're getting your canopy in different layers of growth. There's all sorts of fascinating applications for GIS, geography, where it connects to agriculture. So I got, you know, a good sense of general, let's see.
Kind of the gist.
Just the gist of it, where this all ties together. And I saw that in all my classes, whether it was religion or history, how location plays into so many decisions. And I guess that's the big deal. Location plays into so many decisions.
Awesome. Yeah, that definitely sounds incredibly interesting. And I'm sure, I don't know, you know, you talked about some of the technology involved in in your work, in the in the geographic kind of scanning and all that kind of stuff. A lot of people are surprised to learn that a lot of that technology is used in agriculture too, but on a smaller scale. We use what's called precision agriculture-based technology, which is used to map out, what soil is suitable for growing what kind of crops, for, moisture level content in soil, for, we use infrared to detect the presence of insects and bug life and that kind of thing. So it's interesting to hear that, there's industries, or not industries, but fields of research that are also using those technologies for similar purposes, especially in the geographic kind of sphere of things.
Sure, absolutely. I can't believe I didn't even mention soil science. That was one of my favorite classes. Looking at, I mentioned drainage, but the porosity of the soil and pH, as you said, and how you can treat soil to make it more conducive to crops, or make it less viable for weeds, and so that the crops that you want are going to pull through. And the technology it's fascinating. You can have tractors going by a preset path, so self-driving tractors. If I don't think I'm making that up, I could be making that up, but I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I see this stuff, and maps have power. We all know we've got powerful machines in our pockets. And that's not the only places that these powerful, geo-referencing machines are going. They're going all over the place.
Yeah, no, definitely. And there's definitely a not only a market for them, but there's a future for that technology in the more automated versions of agriculture, of your aspects of research. Anything involving cultivation or use of land, or mapping out anything. That technology is going to be infinitely useful. And as we kind of progress as a society, as our population grows, as our urban development begins or continues to expand, that technology is going to be vital for us to be able to determine exactly how much land we have left, how much of it we still need to preserve, what land is suitable for what kinds of crops, and what land is suitable for environmental protection, and just kind of using the best of our resources to maintain every last inch of usable land we can for our survival.
Yeah, and since you mentioned population growth, that may as well be a nice natural segue into the topic of the thesis, which was not only plotting where I thought Johnny Appleseed traveled based on research, but since I study geography, which is a science, I had to have some sort of testable theory, and just saying this is where he went wasn't a testable theory. And I had to say, okay, well, the theory is going to be that the areas Johnny Appleseed, the real guy, traveled, where he planted apples and cultivated orchards, those are areas where I think population growth would have been spurred on quicker than elsewhere.
Interesting.
And yeah, coming to that sort of theory, it didn't happen overnight. As I said, all my classes sort of melded together in my mind: the religion, the history, and the geography. I loved how often the lines would blur and overlap between various courses I would take. And for whatever reason, I fell in love with both history and geography at the same time. And being from the Midwest as I am, I thought it would be great if I could map something like the extent of the Chicago fire, which it's been done, but I wanted to go a step further and say, if I could calculate all the square footage that was lost in buildings, because few people know this, well, not few, but not everyone knows this. After the Chicago fire, all the wreckage was kind of just pushed into Lake Michigan. And where all the museums are in present-day Chicago, they're sitting on what used to be the lake, and just junk was shoved in the lake, and sort of dirt was put on top of it. So even though everything was burned down in the fire, Chicago gained square footage as a city footprint. And I thought I'd love to be able to map how much they lost versus how much they gained. And of course, a little bit of research told me, all the records I need were lost in a certain fire.
Oh no.
So yeah, that idea didn't go anywhere very far. But shortly after that, I thought, I love history. Lewis and Clark, those are American heroes, but it seems like it's been done before, and I don't know where it came about that I just thought, why not Johnny Appleseed? And sure enough, some quick research turned out that, yeah, he is a real guy, and for the most part, he did do about what we thought he did, but he was also a lot more interesting and a lot more cunning than most people know, or as most stories would tell.
So why don't we kind of, yeah, I mean, that's, I don't know if there's any more to the, the buildup of the backstory that you wanted to go over, but it seems like you established a pretty good foundation of how you got into this topic, why you started to write this thesis in the first place. So if there's any more background, then feel free to give it. But I'm curious about, what did your research show? What was so incredible about your findings that you wrote a whole thesis about it?
Well, the first thing was, preamble's out of the way. We'll just get right into the meat of this, the core of the issue, as a lot of the books that I had to read so cleverly stated. This Johnny Appleseed was born in 1774, so 2 years before the American Revolution, and at that time, well, as most American listeners anyway will know, it was just the original 13 colonies. Not a whole lot of people hanging out in the about-to-be United States, and very little, if anyone, further west of that, just along the eastern seaboard. But what happened after the Revolutionary War was that the Continental Congress, it's a new country. We don't have money to pay all these soldiers. What we can do is say, hey, there's a bunch of land over there. If you want it, we'll give it to you. But even though free land, in most cases, would be a good deal, free land at that point was also scary, uncharted, untraveled land. And so I'll just do a quick history on Mr. Johnny Appleseed, born John Chapman. I don't know if I said that yet.
No.
But real name John Chapman. His father fought in the Revolutionary War, and then they moved. He was born in Massachusetts. They moved to southern Massachusetts, and his dad got him a job working at a cider mill. In those days, water wasn't always potable, and cider was, because it was alcohol, and it was also used to barter or trade, because if you're not near a hub of activity, you might not see actual real dollars. You might just be trading and bartering all over the place. So the cider industry was huge. And after apprenticing for this cider mill, he felt like he got a good grasp on the industry and set off on his own. And since there were so many cider mills all over the place, they're pressing these apples to get the cider, but what's left over is the mush and the seeds. So he'd filter the mush and get these seeds, which were essentially a waste product to the cider mills, and travel down the Ohio River, through Ohio, through Indiana, even into Illinois and Iowa. He jaunted into Michigan, in my research, I believe, and West Virginia as well. So that core early American West, planting trees by sapling. He never liked to graft because he was a very devout man. So he didn't even like cutting trees to graft onto other trees, even though that was an easier way and more sure way to produce apples. But the big thing that people don't know about Johnny Appleseed is that he was sort of a businessman. He would buy this land out west, plant the trees on it, and when settlers came out west, they would see, oh, this is an established area. Something's growing on this that someone cultivated. And listening to your episode on The Martian, it rung straight in my brain. Yeah, when something's planted there, it's a colonized area. This is a safe place we can settle. So Johnny Appleseed was, one thing I read called him a land baron, which seems a little bit harsh, but it is what he did. He would buy up land cheap, plant apple trees on it, and sell it to settlers who moved out west, and he would keep moving further and further west. And just wash, rinse, repeat, until he died at 70, which I think is pretty old for back then.
Yeah, no, that's definitely. I mean, the oldest person we know about back then was Benjamin Franklin. I think he was in his 80s or 90s, but everyone else was like their 50s and 60s when they were dying. So that's pretty impressive that he lived that long.
It is, and they say he walked everywhere across the countryside. So maybe there's something to walking that we all should take a cue from,
You know what?
or just an apple a day. It could be that.
I think that he had the secret to immortality at his fingertips. He had apples. Obviously, no doctor would come near him. He was walking every day, and I don't know about you, but I love walking, and whenever I walk, I feel a lot better about myself.
That fresh country air too.
Man.
Can't be beat.
And that was back, before industrialization, so the air was way cleaner, and it was just like, can't imagine that it was anything but peaceful. And if he's living by himself and just kind of doing his own thing, and he's not bugging anybody, nobody's bugging him, then I can't imagine he was a super stressed out guy all the time. I mean, besides the business aspect of his life, but I mean, sounds like a pretty nice life to me. Just kind of going around from place to place, buying up land and selling it, and just kind of living, doing your thing.
Yeah, I imagine it was a very liberating experience for him.
So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go. Oh no, by all means.
I was just going to. I don't know if you had more you're going to continue on to. I was just going to elaborate on some of the points that you had made so far.
Feel free.
Okay. So in terms of your so like you mentioned my Martian episode, and you kind of brought up the idea that agriculture, that cultivated land is somewhat equivalent or is seen as equivalent as the foundations of a settlement. That agriculture has this foundational tie to society. That's actually a point that I mentioned briefly in The Martian, but I kind of elaborated on more in another episode. I can't remember what episode that was now. But I talked to somebody, I think maybe it wasn't on my podcast, it might have been on somebody else's podcast, but we had discussed the idea that agriculture was the foundational piece of society, and that society is only where it is because of agriculture. Not to say that there weren't other causes, but food seems to be our number one priority, as it should be, and our ability to produce that food is what grounds us to a specific area to build our civilizations. So it's interesting to me that Johnny Appleseed was able to basically create society everywhere he walked. Like as he crossed through the West, he was basically creating new civilizations everywhere he went, because he was creating new farmland. He was creating new settlements, and so that just kind of when you said that, I was kind of intrigued by that, because we often see Johnny Appleseed as this this great American. I'm not sure that myth is the right word. Maybe like legend is kind of more of an accurate way to put it, but because obviously he was a real guy, but people tend to think of him as Johnny Appleseed. He's like the true American. He's he's the founder of American ideals and all this kind of stuff. And so it's ironic that he was literally the founder of a lot of different American civilizations because of his ability to cultivate land and to attract settlers westward. Just as you mentioned, off of the comfort level of them knowing that there's cultivated land there for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And not only that, but he was on good terms with the natives. And I was reading my paper, and I just referred to them as Indians. And this was written a few years ago. Come on, Matt. The Native Americans. Because he not only was he educated in the ways of apples, but all sort of medicinal plants that he would also plant along the way. He knew all these prairie treatments, and he actually went around warning people of the War of 1812, I believe, saying that something you need to get your family out of here because things are gonna get hairy around here. He was sort of not quite, what's the guy? I should know this. I'm in the wrong mindset, though. The British are coming. That guy.
Paul Revere.
Yes, he was a bit of a Paul Revere, saying, there's a skirmish coming. You guys need to get out of here. So his actual deeds, I think, only amplify the picture, the mythic picture that we have of him. And it was kind of funny, a few funny times when I was working on this or presenting this. My advisor, she said she immigrated from China and was teaching at my university. And she said, I was just reading a book about Johnny Appleseed to my children, and then I got to say my student. is actually doing a project on him. And she actually didn't have any idea that he was a real guy. She thought it was just, this character from a kid's storybook, like Paul Bunyan or whatnot. And I remember talking to some students from England at this conference, and they said, "Oh, we don't have any idea who this is," and trying to sort of label what he actually is. The closest I could come to was something like a Robin Hood character for them, someone you've heard stories about your whole life, who did good deeds, but no one actually knows all of the whole story there. And I was glad to be able to sort of shine more light on the whole story.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly interesting. That it's almost like, I think we've learned over time there's a lot of pieces of our history that we still don't know much about, and that we're constantly trying to learn more and more about. And so it's always cool to find somebody that's just like, hey, I happen to be an expert in this person that nobody ever heard of. There's actually a Mexican Robin Hood, Joaquin Murrieta, who was seen as a bandit way back in the day in California. And there's an old cowboy song about him that I thought was incredibly interesting. And so it's like, when you hear those stories, it reminds you of how much, or how little we know about our history as a country. How there are so many important individuals that we either chalk up to being legends or myths, or that we completely forget existed at all. And so it's interesting to me that you're able to kind of shed some light on this kind of stuff. So what kind of reactions were you getting, if you're talking to these kids and these teachers about Johnny Appleseed? How are they reacting to that?
A lot of them were surprised, for one, that he was a real guy, and secondarily that he did do pretty much, again, like, he did what we thought he did, what we've heard he did, which is plant apple trees. Now, by and large, the trees he were planting weren't apples that you're going to go pull off the branch and bite into, because, as he said, a lot of these he was taking from cider mills. And if you're pressing apples into cider, they're not going to be the tastiest apples. No. They're the bitter ones, the sour ones. You're going to ferment them, and it's going to taste good because it's alcohol. That, or they're going to get over-sugared and turned into apple pie or preserves. They're not what you'd find at your grocery store, in most cases anyway. I mean, I can't verify in every case what he did, but yeah, the surprise was that they'd be surprised that he actually did it, surprised that he lived as long as he did, and mostly surprised with the whole land buying thing. They thought, oh, he's just some kind of bumpkin guy out there wearing the tin pot on his head, right? I said, well, there's stories that he did do that, and then he kept a Bible under his belt because he was very religious. But he was also a businessman who was buying up land, selling land, and there are actual records, printed records, handwritten records, that have his name on them, selling 150 apple trees to so-and-so on this side of that river.
Wow.
And just to have, that tangible proof that this, folklore legend actually did these things, it's stunning in some ways.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I was thinking about that, and like you mentioned how, people tend to think, they think of him in terms of the mythology around him, him wearing a pot on his head or him having a Bible under his belt or that kind of thing. Why do you think that some of these characters get almost like treated as if they're cartoon characters instead of historical figures? So, like, for example, I think of George Washington, the story about him cutting down the cherry tree, which has been confirmed to be a myth.
Right.
Why do you think those types of things get fed to us when we're young, and we automatically believe them to be true, and then that creates a false understanding of what actually happened in those old days?
Well, I think part of it is the way that history is recorded. They'll always say that history is recorded by the victors or written by the victors. And in some cases, that's why we know what we know, or that's why what we're telling is being told the way it's being told. I had a lovely class called historiography. So it's analyzing the way history is written. And yeah, you get you get different viewpoints depending on who's writing the story. I mean, we know that. I don't know if it's still true. I haven't looked into it that much, but about schools in the South using textbooks that refer to the Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression. And everything that we're being told is going to be filtered through whoever originally recorded it. So in a lot of the things that I went through, I was dealing with prairie journals, because people living on the prairie back then didn't have much to do except, enjoy the fresh air and write. Or there were a few newspaper references to Mr. John Chapman stopping through town, which I thought, okay, these are a bit less biased than you might get in someone else's account. And I think part of it might just be that you like to tell the good story. The good story as in we're the good guys, and also the good story as in that's a very exciting story and one that a kid is going to latch onto and easily remember.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. And there's a certain aspect of, in order to make history interesting and worth listening to, there has to be a storytelling aspect to it. As a society, and just in general as humans, we've adapted to learning through storytelling and learning how to teach through storytelling. That's why, in many ways we learn by association. We have to be able to associate something conceptual into something we can articulate and realistically apply in order for us to understand it. And so that would make sense, for kids to be able to understand this kind of stuff. We teach it as a story, and that's why it kind of gets lost in translation as, oh, it's just a story versus, no, this actually happened. So in terms of that, this is a little bit of a tangent, but in terms of that structure of education, do you think that we're taking the wrong approach? Like, do you think more people need to know about Johnny Appleseed and how much he did?
I don't think it would hurt. I know I'm biased at this point with all the research that I've done, and I mean, even just talking about it now, I can hear my cadence getting faster and faster because I don't know, I've got it in my heart now for as much work as I put into it. But I think so. Even just to say he bought and sold land, that's one sentence that could be added to his little byline, and that makes people that much more interested, so they'll look him up a bit more or want to learn a bit more.
That would make sense. I mean, I think that there's a certain aspect of the storytelling that needs to be there still. I mean, like, we tell the stories of Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea, but those stories are also confirmed to be, real historical events, and kids are taught to understand that. So I think there's a certain level of mixing that can be done. We can have a hybrid of the storytelling elements that make a kid interested in the topic, but also make sure the kid understands that, those are real things that really happened. And not only are they real things, they're incredibly important things. That's our history, that's our culture being founded. And maybe some of the more philosophical topics that we talked about, like, food and agriculture being the foundation of society, is a little bit too heavy for, 9-year-olds. But I think there's a certain, there's a certain element of,
that's middle school.
Yes,
stuff.
No, exactly. You don't start talking about Plato until you're 12 years old. That's right. But no, I think that there's a certain level of realism that needs to be associated with these stories to help these kids understand just, where their culture comes from. Yeah,
and the whole point of this show, where the food comes from too. Why is the apple pie so American? We didn't have the apple that goes in most apple pies when this country was founded. When the apple that isn't native to North America. We just had crab apples of varying varieties and bitternesses until Europeans traveled to the New World. So the apple we know and love came from Asia. And it was cultivated. Everyone loved it. It went to Europe. Everyone loved it. And it made the trip over here. So just knowing that, wow, an American apple pie, isn't that American? Maybe not, but we sure love it. We're not going to love it any less just because it didn't originate here, just like pizza.
Yeah, I mean, half of our American food does not originate from America. I mean, like you mentioned, pizza. There's a lot of food that we consider American food. I mean, we even consider Chinese food American food at this point. Like
Yeah.
there's just, the new American standard is being a mixture of cultures. American is almost it almost can't be its own culture because it has to be a mixture of cultures for it to exist. So it doesn't surprise me at all that many of our popularly cultivated crops come from other countries. I mean, half of our domesticated animals came from other countries as well. We didn't have cattle and horses in the United States like we do now until settlers brought them over.
Yeah, so we're building bridges here,
Yeah.
I think, in people's
Yeah,
minds.
I like to think so. So I do have a couple questions for you. If
Yeah.
you're if you're complete with your explanation of your thesis.
I have some numbers that I could get
Okay.
into.
We can do it either way.
And-
If you want to go through the numbers first, and I can ask you questions later, or if you want to do the questions first.
Questions are on your mind. Let's go
Okay.
with them.
So you actually, a couple of these might be related to the numbers in your studies. So first of all, how much of his land is still left?
Ooh, that I don't. When he died, I know he had 1,200 acres still in his name. As I was refreshing my memory today, as far as the apple trees go, back the research I did when I was originally doing the project, it seemed like a couple of areas where some of the descendants of the trees are still there. And yeah, it gets a bit tough to follow because apple trees reach maturation within 10 years. And as I said, he didn't like to graft his trees, so his trees were just going to remain intact and whole. So I don't have great depth of detail on that.
Okay. Yeah, and I wasn't sure, if there was any kind of records on that kind of stuff. I know that, that was over 200 years ago, so it's a little bit difficult to have records on that kind of stuff. But I was just curious if there was any kind of recollection of these are all the people who bought land from him. These are all of their descendants, and that land is still in use today. I'd be curious to see how much of his land that he cultivated himself, even if it's not in his name anymore, is still in use for agricultural production, even if it's not for apple trees or if it's not what the original crop was.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I was reading something today that said there were some descendants of his trees. He didn't have any children, but descendants of his trees up in Maine. And I thought, I know for sure that in my research, I never saw anything up in Maine. What I would do is go through various sources, and anytime I found a certain location mentioned twice, I decided, okay, that's good enough for me to say that probably was a place he planted something. And in some of the books, it does list all the sales that they have on record, the land that he sold and who it was sold to, and actually, it probably wouldn't be too difficult to then follow the chain of title, the ownership of that land, to figure out who is in possession of it today. That's actually kind of related to what I do for my real job, working in an assessor's office and dealing with property parcels and all of that. So now my gears are turning in that direction. It's probably deducible to figure out who owns it and what's on it. And actually, what's on it, as long as I dig up my old GIS shape files, I should be able to drop the points back on a map and figure out what's there. But at the moment, I don't have it on hand.
Interesting. So you actually answered another question I had, which you said that he doesn't have any descendants himself. He never had kids or anything like that.
Did not. That was, I believe, part of his devoutness, and I'm sure it also could be tied to his eccentricities and his forever walking and wandering ways. I don't want to make assumptions, but I can't imagine you're going to meet too many people just walking and walking and walking, or even if you do, they might think, well, you're a little funny guy.
Yeah.
And even if I think you're cute, I'm not going to be walking all those miles after you.
Yeah, girls don't tend to go for the homeless guy that lives in the trees.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I was curious to see if there was anyone who was from his lineage that could possibly attest to some of the historical stuff about him. but it seems that his bloodline is kind of lost in history at this point.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Dang.
So.
So, in terms of, you mentioned that his apple trees have descendants though. So are there, you might have already said this, maybe I missed it, but are there trees or at least like seeds or specimen of apples today that are directly related to the original trees that he grew?
I do believe so, yes. And just looking again today, I think I saw something about someone having some seeds somewhere. And in my original research, I remember that there was a tree somewhere, I believe in Indiana, that was one of the, or believed to be one of the originals.
Wow.
And Indiana and Ohio, at least in my research, was where he spent most of his time. In total, I think I approximated about 60 different areas of his orchards, nurseries, plantings, whatever you want to call them. Reading today, some website said they're not orchards because he put fences around the trees to protect them from animals, so they're nurseries. Well, that distinction is kind of meaningless to me, and I assume most people.
Yeah. No, I would say so.
But yeah, I found 60 or so, and by and large, Ohio and Indiana were where he spent the most time. So I wouldn't put it past history or anyone saying that one of them is still out there.
Wow. Yeah, no, that'd be really cool. Just you get to see a tree that was actually related to one of the trees that the Johnny Appleseed planted. I think that'd be kind of like, they should put that in a museum somewhere.
Yeah, no kidding.
So, I have kind of three questions that are connected to each other about your interaction with this whole thing, but we can get to those after your numbers, because I'm kind of curious about what you have up there.
All right. So, what really made this project feasible, or at least a whole lot easier than it otherwise would have been, was the National Historic GIS Association. This website, I believe it was based out of the University of Minnesota, that generated all of these historical shapefiles. And shapefiles just means layers that I can turn on and off on a map and analyze and manipulate, so on and so forth. And in this case, it was boundaries of the U.S. states and counties, historical ones. So at that period of time, the maps were changing constantly. And if I'd had to go and try and digitize these myself, trace them myself, it would have been a whole world of work. But they had these historical shapes of the counties decade by decade by decade. So I got snapshots of what the counties and states looked like as of 1790, 1800, 1810, all through, well, current period, but my study only went up to 1850. And what they additionally had was census files related to those states and counties that I could then tie together of the same. The census is every 10 years, so it was a perfect match of data sets that I could then plop my orchard points on top of and sort of color coordinate where's the population growing higher year after year. And as I said earlier, maturation for an apple tree is about 10 years after planting. So I started looking at the counties where he planted apple trees and looked at its population growth 10 years later and 20 years later to see what sort of effect there was on the population size. And I fully well admit that there are obviously other factors, and both in science and in history, to actually prove something without a doubt is incredibly impossible and is almost never going to happen. So the land being free for the soldiers could lead to population growth. The expanse and implementation of railroads could lead to population growth. But all I'm looking for is a correlation. And a correlation, I believe I did find.
Interesting.
And the biggest, I put together a few charts, but the biggest indicator that my theory is correct was the percent growth. So let me just pull it up. Percent growth would be there's a formula for it, which isn't going to make sense to many people, but the number of the population at point 2 minus the number at point 1. So let's say the population in Macomb County in 1820 minus the population in 1810 divided by the population in 1810 and times 100. That gives you a percent change, how much it changed in those 10 years. And I compared counties with orchards and counties just in general. So the counties with orchards in 1790 to 1800, those grew by 18%. All counties 1790 to 1800, minus 0.37%. 1810 to 1820, counties with orchards grew by 44%. All counties 0.96%. 1820 to 1830, the counties with orchards grew by 72.5%. All counties grew by 2.43%. 1830 to 40, counties with orchards grew by 54%. All counties grew by 3%. 1840 to 1850, those with orchards grew by 37%. All counties grew by 7%. So at least in this, Excel-based statistical analysis, the counties with the orchards had overwhelmingly higher growth rates than those without orchards. And it could just be, sure, people didn't want to go a place no one had been. And if Johnny didn't go there, maybe there was a reason he didn't go there. Or it could be that he's traveling by rivers, and humans are naturally going to want to settle by rivers. But he had to know that too. And in any case, the statistical impression is there. I won't say proof, but the impression that his presence affected population growth is there in the numbers.
Yeah, that's incredibly interesting that he was able to almost just, I mean, it's like we were talking about earlier, he basically just created civilization everywhere he went. I mean, as he walked, people followed. It was kind of, that's kind of amazing. Do you think that so obviously you mentioned that there are other factors involved that could potentially be the cause of that massive population spike. Do you think that do you think that some of those reasons are more related around the aspects of the environment in those areas, or more based around the idea that he was actually cultivating the land there and that made people comfortable in terms of wanting to move there? Like, do you think he picked better land, or do you think that he made the land worth going to?
That's you've worded a good question, and I would hazard to say that he made the land worth going to, or at least more worth going to. If you've got a nice plot of land, the soil looks fertile, but there's nothing on it, and you've got a comparable plot of land, and something is already growing on it. Something, whether it's flourishing or not, it's been proven that something will take here. I'd say you're going to lean towards the land where you already see something will take root, something will grow, something can sustain.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. I would have to, I mean, obviously I haven't done the research, but I would have to agree just from a logic perspective that does tend to make more sense. People tend to go towards settlements in which they know that things are going to grow. They know that they have a sustainable form of food and just work and a way to sustain themselves and their families. Other than, rather than go somewhere where they don't know where things are going to work, but there's nobody there. And not to mention we're herd animals at the end of the day. We're pack animals, and so it makes more sense. That maybe somebody went there and said, "Hey, there's apple orchards here. I want to settle my house here." And then other people were like, "Hey, there's somebody living here," and they all just kind of bunched up together and went there instead.
Right. Yeah, there's safety in numbers, especially in the early American West, where you never know what threat could be around the corner.
So, did you have any more numbers or anything else on your thesis you wanted to go over?
I think that's the numbers I gave were the strongest of the numbers.
Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting stuff.
Let's see. It is. I did find some research. Some sources said that he also constructed cabins from time to time, some that he would use, some that he would sell. And if he's selling land, I wouldn't put that past him either, to just take his business to a whole new level.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously there's a reason we're not referring to him as Johnny Appleseed, Johnny
Right.
Cabin Builder or whatever.
Right.
The apples were the main thing.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that he definitely sounds like a true Renaissance man, just out there just doing it all. He's a farmer, he's a construction worker, he's a businessman. It's kind of incredible.
And very much spreading the word of the Swedenborgian religion.
Right.
I guess that's not one that picked up as well as the Appleseeds, but
yeah, he's
whatever.
He's not Johnny Preacher Man.
Right.
That's funny. Yeah, so that kind of dives into another question that I have, which is more or less a kind of a fun question. Just if you had the opportunity, let's say that you had a time machine or something. If you had the opportunity to talk to Johnny Appleseed, what would be something you'd want to ask him, or what's something you're curious about learning more about him?
Oh man, I guess it would probably have something to do with the endurance. All of the miles he traveled. I remember at one point he was said to have traveled from Iowa all the way back to Pennsylvania in the matter of a few weeks walking. And this was, in his more advanced age. And I don't know if this was when he was trying to get back for a church conference. Because again, very religious guy. And maybe it was the power of God compelling him to just hoof it through the undergrowth and get there. But what he was doing to have that relentless spirit to just keep going, keep walking, and maybe more so how he was able to live so scarce.
Yeah.
He's depicted in ragged clothes with the pot on his head for a reason. Whether or not the pot was ever really there, the ragged clothes, he is described as eccentric and dirty and all, but friendly. So how he got by on just that, and maybe it would lead right back into the good book, my friend. Why don't you take a look? Maybe it was just his devoutness, because there are some stories where he was so friendly with animals that when he saw mosquitoes dive bombing into his fire, he put out the fire because he didn't want to destroy any of God's creatures.
Wow.
He was said to be that caring and loving about all living things, which again is why he didn't like to cut branches and graft trees. He just did it from roots and seeds.
He was one of the first organic farmers.
Yeah, absolutely.
So are there any records on what he was like in terms of, both physically, I'm assuming he's kind of a bigger guy, but also in terms of personality, was he kind of obviously you talked about he's a very devout religious man, so that kind of already paints a picture. He's very very sympathetic towards living beings, and he's very kind soul, but he's also a businessman at the end of the day. So were there any journals or writings or anything like that about how he talked or how he acted or things that he said?
I reread my whole paper today, and I know that there's stuff that I did not put in it that were a bit more, story-esque. And I don't have anything on what he said, but there are various depictions of him in drawings, and he's usually just sort of a tall, slender man. But I do know that he had to be at least somewhat. I wouldn't say anyone was out of shape back in those days, but he worked as an apprentice in an orchard and at a cidery. After that, he built boats in Pittsburgh, and he actually left from there. He strapped two canoes together, loaded with seeds and saplings, and set off down the river. And that's where his story begins. And built cabins. So I'm guessing he was probably fit, especially if he lived to 70 and was hoofing it all over the place. And I've used the word eccentric a few times here describing him, because I do recall that's kind of how he was described, whether it was due to his religion or just that people are establishing communities here, there, and everywhere, and here's this guy who just sort of walks through town barefoot. And so he was kind of eccentric because people are trying to live comfortably, and he's not. He's making the choice to live uncomfortably. Maybe he's comfortable in his own mind, but to everyone else's point of view, he's kind of different. But that's not to say they didn't get along with him. There were a couple of books, I think, that said he would talk to children and say, when you're done with your apples, go throw the cores outside or save the cores and I'll come collect the seeds. Because he liked to get along with people. And if they said, oh, you should come into our house, he would say, no, I'm dirty. I'm going to sleep in your barn because I don't want to invite my here are the medicinal herbs that you might need, but no, I'll sleep outside.
Huh. Interesting.
Because he didn't want to bring that part of, I guess, not that he was ashamed or anything. He was just especially humble.
Out of courtesy. Interesting. So, yeah. I mean, he sounds like a pretty stand-up guy. I mean, like, he's the kind of guy you want to meet, but a little bit of a strange homeless man.
Yeah.
That's incredibly interesting. So, was there anything else in your thesis that you wanted to go over in particular? Any other interesting facts? Any other numbers?
Let's see. I'll do a quick scan here and see if any words pop out at me.
Yeah, I know in California we have, I cannot remember for the life of me what it's called now. We have an organization that is doing similar things to what you're doing. We're trying to find historical sites of ancient apple trees in California. I don't remember what the organization is called now, but I actually talked to a gal that's part of it, and she, because she raises apples up in the hills here, and she's, extremely intelligent on that kind of stuff. Like, she knows, they have an entire, I think it's called like a legacy orchard or something like that. They have an orchard entirely dedicated to ancient trees that that were from like the early days of California and stuff. It's really, really interesting stuff. I don't know why apples are so historical, but they are everywhere.
Yeah, it's something not related to my project at all, actually. I was just on a different podcast somewhat recently, just talking about apples because rolling into fall, it's on everyone's mind, going to the orchard and getting some fresh, crisp apples. But that every apple you have is in some way a clone, because nowadays all apples are sort of grafted. The way that Johnny Appleseed didn't want to do it is the way that they're all done today, because otherwise you don't know what you're going to get. The way the apples cross-pollinate, if I'm remembering correctly, that it's kind of a genetic mystery, or kind of a lucky chance game. You're not sure what you're going to get when two apple trees naturally breed with each other, that whether it'll produce good fruit or something disgusting. So most apples today are just cut a branch off, graft it on another tree, and you're going to get that same good apple. So that's really cool to hear that they're growing these sort of historical ones that are lost, because a lot of varieties of apples do just sort of fade out, whether or not it's because people just didn't like them, they weren't as useful. Because I mean, we know this even in the apples we get from the grocery store, that not every apple tastes the same, feels the same, is used for the same purpose. So with changing trends over the years and changing weather patterns, growth patterns, things could die out, whether due to our choice or just it stops growing and you can't get it back. So I don't know if it's reassuring or hopeful that they're doing something like that to sort of preserve the history of the trees. That way we don't lose what sort of, was there. It's important to have history in all aspects of life, and food, I think, it needs to be thought of more when we think about history.
Yes, definitely. And that's a big thing that I talk about a lot on this podcast, is that, as much as history is important, and I'm a big history nerd, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love history. A lot of important aspects of history are centered around agricultural endeavors that are often overlooked. I mean, just in United States history, we had like the cotton gin was revolutionary for industrialization in the United States. People forget what the cotton gin even does. You have the You have like Shays' Rebellion, which was a huge thing in terms of learning about governmental power and control. There's so many aspects of agriculture that are important to history, and some of them aren't agriculture themselves. Like Shays' Rebellion, yes, they were farmers, but it wasn't the fact that they were farmers that made their rebellion important. But we have agriculture is so closely tied with history in so many different ways, and not just agriculture, but just the earth in general, the environment, the like the stuff that you study, all the geographical, that's not the word, geographic research that's being done right now is finding stuff that is incredibly relevant to history that is just forgotten in the stories about wars and great presidents. Which, I mean, don't get me wrong, that stuff's important too, and it's all really interesting to learn about. But there's so much about our relationship with food and our relationship with the earth and agriculture and all those things involved that make our history what it is.
Yeah, I don't know why it took me so long to remember this, but I also did a project, just an essay, on Cyrus McCormick, the inventor of the Reaper, which revolutionized agriculture, at least out here in the West. We've got a convention center named after the guy, so
Wow.
So he must have been a big deal, right?
No, for sure.
But I'm guessing most visitors to the McCormick Center in wonderful Chicago, Illinois, don't know that it's named after a guy who helped spur on sort of an agricultural revolution.
Yeah. No, a lot of people don't realize how, and like we mentioned earlier, how much technology is involved in agriculture today. They don't realize how much agriculture has evolved over the years and how many people were responsible for that maybe they did other things in history that they're remembered for, but they're not remembered for innovating new things that enabled us to have food that was safer, healthier, better for us, all this kind of stuff, and more readily available. So it's kind of it's interesting. It's sad to me, as somebody who advocates for agriculture often. It's sad that agriculture and the environmental aspects of the conversation get kind of left out. But I understand why it happens, and that kind of stuff isn't always as interesting, but it is definitely just as if not more important.
Yeah, I think it's probably out of sight, out of mind. Our culture is kind of you don't have to think about something that's just there. It's just there.
Yeah.
It's I don't know whether it's directly sort of comparable to viewing meat as only meat and not as an animal that had to be raised and shipped and processed. But I think it's kind of the same thing. Oh, it's just there. It's called beef. It's not cattle. It's not a cow. It's just there. No, it's not just there. A whole lot has to happen for it to get just there.
No, exactly. And that's a big part of the conversation that gets left out a lot is that, your food doesn't just show up in the grocery store. You don't just, like they don't run out of milk and just go get more milk in the back. Like there's an entire process to getting that food to where it is. And there's an insane amount of work and, regulation and technology and inspection and, all of this red tape that's around getting that food to where it ends up. Not to mention, the actual practice parts of it, like you mentioned with beef. There's an insane amount of work that goes into raising those cattle properly and making sure that they're healthy and making sure they're taken care of and all of those things. And if that process fails, then we don't have food. And, the whole purpose behind the podcast and the whole purpose behind talking to people about this kind of stuff is that if they don't realize that and they're voting on things and they're making purchasing decisions and they're making personal decisions to boycott certain farms or whatever, they're hurting more than just that one farmer. They're hurting our entire food supply because there's so many different things that rely on each other to work properly for our food to be readily available and affordable and healthy and all that kind of stuff. People don't realize how the process works, and because of that, they tend to hurt more of it than they tend to help when they think that they're trying to help out some cause.
Wow, that's a powerful point. But I actually think you talked about a gallon of milk. They don't just go and get another one back, and that actually reminded me of an essay and project I did in high school, all about milk and cow's milk versus all the other things that are being produced these days that we call milk, and everything involved with that, whether or not we should be drinking milk or not as humans, what goes into it, the pasteurization,
exactly. I think there's a lot of
how it's different, like in China versus the United States. That's for another episode, maybe.
No, I could go on forever. Milk is a topic that's infinitely discussable, in my opinion. No, we might definitely have to do a follow up, to talk about all of those other things.
Yeah.
But no, for sure. I think that, kind of wrapping back up towards the Apple, the topic of discussion, just because we're getting kind of long in this episode here, and I don't want to keep you for too much longer because I know I'm sure you're busy as well. But I did have a few more questions, just, kind of, like I said, kind of more personally connected, how you connect to this project. So how has this project changed your life in terms of, like, has it opened your eyes to anything that you weren't familiar with before? Has it changed your mindset or your perspective on things? Like, how is this project, or how is this, how has your involvement in this, changed your experience with things?
Honestly, first and foremost, it's just that it changed my opinion of the guy. That he's a real guy, and not only, I'll repeat it again, did he do what we think he did so much more. And the cunning that was there to buy the land, to sell the land, to make it a business of growing these orchards. But beyond that, it's just, I won't say it was indulgent research, but for everyone doing a project on the rusty crayfish in my year of college, or doing a project on smog in the atmosphere, I got to say that I studied Johnny Appleseed and his orchards. And to be able to research something like this, it was just a joy. When you can find joy in your work, in your research, in anything like that, it's liberating. Like I said, for the guy himself walking out there doing what he loved, this was a labor of love, and it was great to feel that in college. I think for as much work as it was, and I know not every college or university requires students to do senior theses, but maybe they should, as long as they let you pick what you're going to do. Because when you can pick what you're going to pour yourself into, the results speak for themselves. And I had fantasies about, maybe writing a book about this. And now, as I've gotten into other things, I'm thinking, well, maybe a play or a series of nonfiction, not nonfiction, but fictional books. I read Dean Koontz's Frankenstein series recently after reading Mary Shelley's original Frankenstein. And Dean Koontz takes and puts Frankenstein in the modern day, but it's the same Frankenstein monster from Mary Shelley's book. In his universe, Mary Shelley's book was just propaganda, and the same monster has been walking the earth for 200 years. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be cool to have a story with Johnny Appleseed, and he's still out there. And so, in many ways, I guess I'm saying that it's just inspired me to do things about the things that I find interesting.
Yeah, no, definitely. I definitely am on board with you with all of that. I think that in terms of, addressing each of the points you made, in terms of the, having seniors in college write their theses, I personally would be on board with that because I love writing papers like that. I mean, I've had 2 or 3 different theories that I've been working on research papers for the past couple of years that I haven't finished yet. But it's just incredibly interesting stuff to me. And so I would definitely be on board with that. I'm not sure if it should be a requirement because not everyone is all, intellectual and research oriented like some people. But no, that's...
I suppose it depends on what you're studying.
Right. No, I think that's definitely...
Not everything.
Yeah, that's definitely a good way of looking at it. But no, I think it'd be really, really interesting to see, to see more developments like what you're talking about, more stories around Johnny Appleseed that kind of correct the mythology. And I'm a big fan of Mary Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I grew up loving the whole like Frankenstein monsters idea, and I actually read the book in high school, and I was a big fan of it. I thought it was a really, really interesting book. It's actually one of my favorite like classic literature books for the longest time, and it still is one of my favorites. So like, to
It
hear
was great. Yeah.
to hear people recreating that idea and and putting it in a modern light is just really, really, fascinating stuff to me. And I would love to see, if you decided to go on and produce fictional writing or to produce a play or a movie or something kind of putting a new modern spin on Johnny Appleseed that tells his real story. I think that'd be really, really interesting to see how that would turn out.
I won't keep it a secret if it happens.
Well, yeah, if you end up going through with it, you're coming back for another episode so that you can advertise it.
Oh, absolutely.
So I had one more very important question that is the most important question of this entire episode.
Oh boy.
So, as I'm sure it's fairly obvious by now, you're a pretty big fan of Johnny Appleseed.
Yep.
Do you eat apples every day in his honor?
I don't. Gosh darn it, I don't. But I should.
I mean, maybe not every day, but you got to have an
Somebody's
apple every
gotta
now
do
and
it
then for
for
your
him.
boy Johnny.
Oh boy.
Oh,
We
are
cut
you
out.
still there?
Okay, we're
I
back.
think we might have cut out for a second. Did you hear what I said?
Yes, and I said I don't,
okay.
but I
Yeah,
should.
no, I said, you gotta have an apple. Maybe not every day, but you gotta have an apple every now and then for Johnny.
Yeah, but bite into one for Johnny,
Yeah.
everybody.
So, and actually, I just came up with this. Do you think if you were living back in late 1700s, early 1800s, do you think that you could have lived like Johnny Appleseed did?
No, I would have planted kiwi.
You would have planted kiwi. You've been Matt Kiwi seed.
Well, yeah, kiwi seed. But seriously, no, I don't think so. I'd want at least a little more of that 18th century, 19th century luxury. Shoes, maybe. Call me crazy, but I like a good pair of
Yeah,
shoes.
I think that's a fair request. Maybe a permanent house.
Yeah, I guess throughout my childhood and still to this day, I enjoy walking barefoot, but showering and bathing
Yeah, those might be
are
might be nice.
good habits, along with apple eating.
Right,
are
right.
Things we
Although
should do.
to be fair, the man did live to be 70 back in an age where people died at 50. So maybe walking around barefoot and not showering is the way that you live forever.
He had strong arches, I guess.
Oh man. So yeah, those are all the questions I had. I'm going to give you another opportunity to plug your podcast and kind of talk about anything else you want to plug or anything like that if you would like to.
Sure. If you forgot, my name's Matt. I am the co-host of ReviewParty.com. Not related to anything I talked about on this podcast at all, but if you enjoyed hearing my voice, check it out. It's available wherever you find your podcasts. We just look at user-submitted reviews from Amazon, Yelp, wherever, and find the craziness that exists in all of us that some people choose to post online.
Oh man, I still haven't gotten a chance to listen to it, but I'm very much looking forward to hearing how that turns out because it sounds very interesting to me.
It can be a riot.
As someone who enjoys looking through hilarious reviews, I'm sure it'd be very entertaining. So yeah, so thanks again, thanks Matt for coming on and telling us all about Johnny Appleseed. It sure was a pleasure to have you on and learn about this slightly different, but very interesting topic nonetheless.
Right. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about it, Brendan, and a pleasure to talk to you as well, and just to listen to your podcast, even when it doesn't feature my own little theories.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm always, my door's always open. You're always happy. You're always welcome to come back and ask more questions about agriculture, or maybe just kind of, it seems like you have a fairly decent understanding of a lot of things I talk about. So I'd be happy to, discuss more about, the philosophies of agriculture, or, even more like historical aspects of agriculture that don't get discussed as much, or, just kind of talk about the technology. I mean, I'm always up for any kind of conversation. So if you want to come back on, you just let me know and you've got yourself a spot.
All right. It sounds like we've got a milk date.
Nope. Did you cut out again?
Yeah. Did you hear my milk date?
No,
joke?
I didn't.
Sounds like we've got a milk date.
Perfect. So, yeah, no, that's all I got for this episode. So, yeah, thanks again, Matt, for joining me. Thanks to all my listeners for tuning in. And don't forget, if you ate today, thank a farmer.